Hey everyone, Alexander here, and welcome back to 30 Days of Symphony. Well, I want to congratulate all of you for joining me on that incredible, gigantic four-course banquet of the four symphonies of Johannes Brahms, along with the 9 symphonies of Beethoven, the great kind of Mount Everest of 19th century symphonic music, certainly from the Austro-German lands. And just as we had, as with Beethoven, as we had a prequel before the first of those 9 symphonies, so now do we have a sequel, as I wanted you to experience one of Brahms's kind of dry runs at a symphony, that D major, that lovely, very Mozartian D major orchestral serenade before we got to the substantial, that meaty first course of the Brahms Symphony No. 1. As yesterday we covered the Brahms Fourth Symphony, of course, that great musical depiction of Brahms as this lion in winter, as I said. Now we get to have a really fun dessert, kind of a chocolate bomb, a strawberries Romanoff, a baked Alaska, this huge, fabulous dessert of a kind of pseudo-symphony. It's one of the most fascinating works and gorgeous works in the repertoire, scored for very large orchestra. It is Arnold Schoenberg's, not very well regarded. This is not Maestro Mr. A here being on one of his eccentric tangents. This is a very, very well regarded orchestration from 1937 by Arnold Schoenberg of the 1862 early, brilliant, boisterous piano quartet, the Piano Quartet No. 1, the Opus 25 of the young 20-something Johannes Brahms. Now you'll remember my little story about the 20-year-old Brahms calling on Robert and Clara Schumann, then the great reigning musical couple of all of Europe, in 1853, and both of the Schumanns take to Brahms like a duck to water. And Schumann writes that very kind of over-the-top article in his Music Criticism magazine, talking about how the young Brahms is going to be, again, if you look at the pictures from this era, the brilliant, blonde, beautiful young Brahms is going to be the savior of German music, to quote Brahms's eventual rival, Wagner, like Lohengrin, the savior figure that all of Central Europe has been waiting for. Finally, there will be a worthy successor to the symphonies of Beethoven. The young Brahms had presented Schumann with these 3 early piano sonatas, actually rather strange works of a very young Brahms, and Schumann ecstatically refers to them as veiled symphonies. I don't quite agree. However, Arnold Schoenberg in the Hollywood Hills in 1937 was definitely right when he saw, indeed, in this early piano quartet, again, this work written before he had even seriously thought of writing a first symphony, is very much a symphony in disguise. In fact, when you hear and watch the brilliant performance that I'm introducing, you will probably even forget that it even began its musical life as a work of chamber music. Excuse me. Brahms wrote this piano quartet. He started it in, 1856, when he was 23 years old. Schumann, for whom Brahms was the only visitor allowed to the insane asylum where Schumann spent his final days. Schumann has just died, and Brahms is the kind of, how does one say it, very special friend, Schumann's widow, Clara Schumann, not only Robert Schumann's unfailing helpmate to him as the great composer he was, and mother of his children, but also simultaneously perhaps the greatest pianist of 19th century Germany, really one of the very, very greatest pianists of the 19th century anywhere. Clara, with whom Brahms will enjoy this rich and complicated lifelong friendship, Clara is at the piano. Like many works, most works of Brahms, it's not like a Mozart piece. Mozart is God's stenographer, where he would just write into score the finished product. Like Beethoven, like Schumann, Brahms had to spend years sketching things out and constantly revising. He began the work in 1856. It was finished in 1862. It was at the beginning of a pattern that would remain with Brahms throughout his career. There was like a dual world premiere. The very first performance was in Brahms's hometown of Hamburg, and the second of the two premieres took place in Vienna. And of course, that's very important because it was Vienna that Brahms, who, again, in the many, I don't want to say hypocrisies, but contradictions that made up the life and work of Johannes Brahms. Brahms, who went through his life ever the stern, kind of staunch, North German bourgeois professor. It was Vienna where he would soon make his hallowed home for the rest of his days. The quartet is in the four movements that you would usually have in a symphony, and it is of intensely symphonic character. Now, you'll remember I mentioned Arnold Schoenberg's name a few times before, because it was Schoenberg, while he was founding that arch-modern school of composers called, we now refer to as the Second Viennese School of the very early 20th century. These were the guys who invented 12-tone composition, serial tonality, this very dissonant music, very avant-garde that, I hate to say it, but to this day, most audiences hate to listen to. I can understand it's not the easiest music to listen to in the world, but it is absolutely perfect in its construction. It has its own kind of elegance, and it's, again, on this 12-tone harmonic system, which to many an ear sounds dissonant. However, when Schoenberg is the vanguard of this Second Viennese School, he writes a very famous essay called Brahms the Progressive. Now, you have to remember, in the early 20th century, Brahms had since passed away, and he was being just dismissed as this hidebound old, again, North German professor, this kind of hopelessly traditional and conservative composer, and not someone anyone would be interested in the heady days of the early 20th century when, let's say, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, or was the music everybody wanted to hear. Schoenberg wrote this famous, legendary essay called, again, Brahms the Progressive, where he talks about how Brahms, within that kind of very traditionalist North German symphonic school, if you will, that he takes on from people like Beethoven and Haydn and Mozart to the south, of course, in Austria. But this very traditional manner of composing German music, Brahms is actually within that tradition this great progressive, in that he develops, based on the music of Beethoven and before that, Joseph Haydn, this idea, this concept of developing variation, where he doesn't wait for the development section in a sonata form to develop his thematic material. Rather, from the very beginning of him presenting a theme, he's already constantly developing it. It's truly amazing to listen to the first movement of the Brahms G minor piano quartet and not only be swept away by its kind of sensuality and drama, this smoky, mysterious quality it has, but then to also think that all of the themes, are like 5 different themes of the exposition of the first movement, each theme comes out of what has gone before. He's just constantly developing his material. And then he does get to the central development section of this sonata allegro form, and he develops the material further. And then the recapitulation is a further development. And actually the first 2 themes are presented in reverse. So you just lose yourself again in this kind of smoky, mysterious, very ardent kind of young composer who's got something to prove kind of mood of this piece. It's amazing. The second movement is the traditional place of the scherzo in this piece. In a symphony, the scherzo can be sometimes in the second movement, most often in the third. However, here again at the very beginning, Brahms is insisting that he is going to be his own man when it comes to the kind of dance-like movement of a weighty kind of four-movement piece. He doesn't write a scherzo like a kind of a scherzo of a Beethoven symphony or quartet. He doesn't write a kind of a minuet like Haydn or Mozart or even Schubert would. He writes again this very dreamy, nostalgic, kind of gropingly mysterious C minor theme, and again it's a scherzo, kind of a dance, but there's just, scherzo is the Italian word for joke, and there's nothing funny about this scherzo. Brahms is setting out his own style. He's not going to do that typical Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann symphonic scherzo. He's going to do something darker, more ruminative, more mysterious. Again, absolutely gorgeous. The third movement is the slow movement of our symphony in disguise. And it is just this glorious, gorgeous, open-hearted song. It's in a big, kind of we call ternary form, just a big three-part form of A, B, A, in which again, it's along the way he develops his ideas as Brahms always does, but this is Brahms at his most simple in the very best sense of the word. Just this broad three-part form, and then these big, gorgeous melodies that, again, when you hear them played by the full orchestra, you wonder how this music was ever crunched into the kind of musical straitjacket of a piano quartet, just, a piano and violin, viola, and cello. The finale is the most famous movement of this Opus 25 piano quartet of Brahms. It is a Hungarian gypsy rondo. It's established for Brahms a style that he would go back to again and again throughout his long career. As I said, Brahms very soon made the move from Hamburg in northern Germany to Vienna, which would be his lifelong home. And of course, Vienna then was the capital not only of Austria, but of the great broad swath of the Habsburg Empire. One of the great amazing moments in Western civilization, this sprawling empire that went all the way to the western border of Russia, to what is now Ukraine and the Balkans, and an amazing time in history. Vienna was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, but the great second city, was the capital of the Hungarian sphere of the Habsburg Empire, that city, of course, being Budapest. And Brahms did visit Budapest from time to time, but he was a firm adopted Viennese, but he absolutely loved writing and playing music in the very mercurial, intense Hungarian style. This Hungarian gypsy rondo is in a vast rondo form. Now, a rondo form is where you have this very memorable main theme, main idea, and then you have these episodes, these other themes that come in now and then, but that main idea just comes back again and again and again and again. And each time, in this case, it's kind of a little faster and more intense. To hear this gypsy rondo played in its original form as a piano quartet is, given the right musicians, is a fabulous and exciting experience, but to hear it played by a full symphony orchestra is something else again. Arnold Schoenberg, the vanguard of the Second Viennese School, a composer whom people to this day whose music people loved to hate, was like so many musicians, artists, and just people from Europe of Jewish heritage, was of course facing dire persecution by the early 1930s. Arnold Schoenberg was one of the lucky ones. He managed to get out and get to the United States, and he famously, for the next 20 years, had a teaching position in Los Angeles at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Yes, Arnold Schoenberg taught music at UCLA, and he actually developed a celebrated cadre of pupils. Schoenberg became part of this incredible artistic milieu of from the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s that included everyone from Igor Stravinsky, Walt Disney, Sergei Rachmaninoff, George Gershwin, Charlie Chaplin, all the big Hollywood stars. They all mingled, they all went to parties together, got up to no end of mischief, and just together created what is probably the zenith of what we call mid-century American culture. Schoenberg in the 1930s was realizing that not everybody loved his very astringent, dissonant brand of composition. So he decided to orchestrate not only some of his earliest works, one of which being his chamber symphony, which we'll get to in our journey a little later. He also orchestrated works of 19th century and 18th century composers for modern performance. And the most famous of these was his, I must say, this brilliant idea to orchestrate, to treat the Brahms early G minor piano quartet to a full orchestral sound. And this is not, it's very important to note that he is not orchestrating the Brahms piano quartet as if Brahms had done it himself. This is for a lush, early, kind of mid-20th century Hollywood orchestra. It was written for performance by the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Back then, as now, one of America's great orchestras, playing at the Hollywood Bowl. And this is for a lush, kind of golden age of Hollywood movie, cinema, symphonic scoring. It's a very large string section, not double, but triple woodwind. So you have like two clarinets, for example, but also an E-flat clarinet and a bass clarinet. The kind of woodwind section Brahms himself would never, ever have written for as this great, small C conservative North German traditional composer. He basically wrote for the orchestra that Beethoven had written for 75 years earlier. So this is this lush Hollywood orchestration. There's a gigantic percussion section, and it's absolutely over the top, and yet it totally, totally works. So for now, Brahms's G minor piano quartet from 1862, this early masterpiece of a symphony in disguise, as orchestrated in 1937 by the great modern Viennese master, Arnold Schoenberg. And this really fabulous performance, one of the great German radio orchestras. And as you may know, Germany, like Scandinavia and Great Britain, has these really august, this tradition of great radio orchestras. The Frankfurt Radio Symphony is conducted by another of these great old school, very eccentric German conductors, Christoph Eschenbach, a name you might know as a Midwesterner because for many years he was the music director of the Ravinia Festival, the summer home of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra on the Chicago North Shore. Like Arnold Schoenberg, a conductor not everybody likes, but personally, I think there is no conductor alive today who can get a more lush, layered sound from a symphony orchestra as he. So again, Christoph Eschenbach in this Brahmsian dessert, the Brahms Piano Quartet as orchestrated by Arnold Schoenberg.